This is a 1986 CR250. I was pretty excited about this bike when I found it. If you watch the motocross scene from the 80s and you pay attention to the way the races were regulated, you may know that 1986 was kind of a pivotal year. Honda dominated the motocross scene, and in part it was because they had the funds to build up the works bikes that the riders would use. So in 1985, the works bike was significantly different than the stock factory bike. In 86, the rules changed, and the bikes used in the races had to be materially stock. I don't know the exact language they used, but they weren't allowed to dump tons of money into the bikes that they put on the track. So what Honda did was took all of their innovations from their 85 works bike and dumped it into the 86 factory bike. So there are some really substantial changes to the power plant in 1986, in particular the power plant, other things as well. But the engine's pretty exciting. We get rid of some of that ATAC valve system they had on the exhaust. Now we have this HPP, it's the Honda Power Port, and while it has its own problems and frailties when it's functioning properly, it works really amazingly well. So this bike, for its age in particular, is really pretty amazing. It has great power. The power delivery is smooth and clean and predictable. So I was pretty excited to find this bike. When I got it, it ran, but it was weak. It clearly needed some at least top-end work and who knows what else. So I tore it down, and while I was at it, decided to tear it down to the frame. Did some sanding and painting. Thought about powder coating, but didn't want to go so nice that I didn't feel like I could ride the bike. That's a different story for a different day. So I cleaned it all up, put all the new stuff on it, had the top end completely redone. The power port's all cleaned up, functions really smoothly, new piston rings, replated cylinder, the whole nine. And got pretty excited about it. Put it back together and have been fighting this bike now for 2 months, trying to figure out why I can't get it to run. It's got an intermittent spark problem. Well, at least originally was an intermittent spark problem. So I started testing, originally discovered that one of the stator coils behind the flywheel here seemed to be bad. So I ordered a replacement stator coil assembly and plate off of eBay, just a used one, and put it on there, and it was no better. That's actually a little bit surprising when you discover what the end problem was. So then I went to the CDI, and I found a CDI on eBay and put that on there. The CDI is a little more difficult to test, so it's hard to know. Stator coils were checking out with proper resistance. The way those are checked, by the way, I don't have this uncovered very well, but these wires that come out from here, there's 2 sets on this bike, and they vary a little bit by year, but basically you've got a set of wires that come off of the stator coils behind the flywheel, and then this is the trigger coil, and a couple wires come off of it as well. That one's an intermittent signal to the CDI that tells it when to send the spark through the coil. So I tried a new CDI, I tried a different ignition coil, of course tried several different spark plugs, all to no avail. I would get intermittent spark, and when it would run it was really weak and then would falter. And eventually got to where there was just no spark at all. And it didn't matter what combination of coil, CDI, and stator I put on there, it was just not right, ever. It was either intermittent or non-existent spark. So I started doing some additional testing, and instead of just testing the ohms and the resistance across the different coils, which is meaningful and it's a great starting point, I decided to actually test voltage. So I got my trusty volt or multimeter. I use this one. It's not anything particularly fancy or expensive. In fact, I think it's a Harbor Freight thing. I don't even know, probably. Set it up on volts, AC volts to be specific, and hook that then up to the stator leads, which come out of here. They're up. They go up into the CDI up in here. So I put the ends of the multimeter on there, and then I put a drill on here, and this is a little tricky because of the direction of spin. But I put the drill on there and spun it carefully, not to loosen the nut, and read the voltage off of there, and I was getting great voltage off the stator. So, okay, that checks out. In fact, in my case, I don't know what RPM I was spinning, and the way these work, you get higher voltage at higher RPMs. But in the, I don't know, 1 to 2,000 RPM range, I suspect, I was getting in the magnitude of about 40 volts AC, which I actually don't know exactly what it's supposed to be, but that's certainly sufficient. So I didn't question too much now whether I'm getting the power I need out of the stator. The trigger coil is a little bit of a different story. The trick here is that it's so intermittent that reading it with a standard multimeter doesn't quite do the job. So I had to round up one of these max voltage testers. This is the one that I used. What this does is replaces the leads in the multimeter, and basically it has a capacitor in this box right here so that it can kind of remember the voltage, so to speak. So it pulses out of the system, but the multimeter can still read it. So I hooked that up onto the multimeter and ran the thing spun the flywheel over the stator and got the reading on voltage there and was getting a meager 2 volts and thought that just doesn't seem right. So I started doing some research and I learned something new that I didn't know, and maybe some of y'all are smarter than I am and you already knew this because you're brilliant electricians. But the gap between the trigger coil and the flywheel has a whole lot to do with how much voltage comes off of that trigger coil. So I got out my trusty, rusty feeler gauges just to see where the thing was sitting. This is my biggest one is at 25 thousandths, and it easily cleared that at the time. And to be sure, to test that, you actually have to bring that over here where the trigger is on the flywheel. You see that extra little bump right on there. That's the trigger, right? That matches up with the trigger coil, and at that point, that's when the spark gets sent. So that's the indicator, and really what it's doing is giving you a crank position up to the intelligence system, the CDI. So I got my trusty rusty feeler gauge and put it out, and it was way beyond the 25 thousandths. Recommended gap is closer to about 15. And so I started playing with the thing, and this is actually not all that terribly scientific anymore. I moved the flywheel to where the trigger point is out of the way. I got myself just a little screwdriver and pushed that down just a little bit, bent the trigger coil closer to the flywheel. Now you want to keep it to where it's not interfering. If that hits, then you got a different problem, right? But that's obvious. And spaced it down to where I was about 10 or 15 thousandths between it. Ran the test on the voltage again with the max voltage reader and got somewhere now in the neighborhood of 10 volts, which is, of course, a material difference from the 2 that I was getting in the beginning. And wouldn't you know it, I put the spark plug back on there and I got a big fat blue spark out of that bad boy. So my 2-month trial with this thing is now over. It runs amazingly well. I'm really excited about it. We're going to get out and play with it here over the next week or so. But it should be kind of a fun bike. It's been now gussied up enough that it's presentable, but not so much that I don't feel like I can't ride it and go tear up some dirt. So if you have spark problems, yeah, the odds are that it's with some stator or something somewhere, but you just might have that same problem where the trigger coil is a little too far away from the flywheel and you're not getting adequate voltage up to the CDI to indicate spark timing. Give that a shot. Hope that saves you some effort. Till next time.